So the first session this afternoon is from Merve Mollaahmetoglu, who is a current Exeter PGR and hosts the excellent podcast Addicted to Research, which is hosted by several PhD students at various stages of their research, all funded by the Society for the Study of Addiction. They discuss the highs and lows of research addiction, no pun intended. I'll share a link to the podcast in the chat after the talk. I highly recommend it. It's really insightful and they have some interesting guests as well. Merve is going to cover podcasting for research from start to finish, from settling on the basic premise of your podcast all the way to recording and editing. So take it away, Merve.
Great, thank you. That's a really nice introduction. So my name is Merve and I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter. So I'll be giving a workshop on research communication based on communication with podcasting based on my previous experiences. Just a little bit about the podcast. So my experience with podcasting started about a year ago when we had an idea to make a podcast about PhD experiences with fellow PhD students who were also funded by the Society for the Study of Addiction. And just to give you an idea of timelines, we had our initial idea around June last year, and we started planning and developing it over the summer. And our first episode was released at the end of September 2020, starting with an episode every 2 weeks. So there's a bit of preparation involved before it's released as well. So our main aim with the podcast was to reach addiction-based PhD students in the UK. So we were very pleased to see that the number of listens extended our intended audience, and also the podcast has been listened across the world, which is really interesting because we didn't necessarily try to reach this broadly. So that's quite nice to see that. So back to the workshop. How can you get started with podcasting? So today I'm going to cover different steps involved in developing a podcast, and the idea is that you should develop a basic understanding of important considerations in developing and producing a podcast, but be able to seek out further information on specific aspects that you'd like to learn more about. So this is introductory because there's a lot more in-depth information on each stage that I wouldn't be able to cover in one session, but I'll be directing you to relevant resources so you can do that. Okay, so before we get started, just to get an idea about people's experiences. So first of all, how would you define a podcast, and what is your experience with podcasting, and how much do you know about it? And if you want to use podcasts, what do you want to use it for? So what purpose would you like to use podcasting for? So if you want, you can use a chat function. If you want to speak, I'm happy to do that as well. So whatever is preferable, just to get an idea of where people are at. Okay, there's already some chat. Anthrozoology podcast. Oh, cool. Oh, Chris, Sarah, and I run the Anthrozoology podcast. Great. Heavy user of podcast. On average, spend 2 hours per day on Spotify. So is that like how much you listen to podcasts, I'm guessing? Yeah, I'm very heavy podcast listener as well. Probably every morning when I'm getting ready. Yeah. So I'm guessing, yeah, some people with a bit of experience of podcasts, and people are quite familiar with podcasts, perhaps from a listening perspective, but not so much, I'm guessing, from making a podcast. I'm just about to end my first podcast episode this month. Okay, that's exciting. Love psychology podcast while I drive home. Great. That's my background, so that's good. Okay, so we've got a couple of responses. Yeah, if you've got any more to add on that, feel free to do so. So I guess in terms of a definition of a podcast, just briefly, a podcast is a digital audio file that you make available online, and that can be downloaded on a computer or a mobile device, and it's typically available as series or new installments, which can be received by the subscribers. So it's similar to a radio show, but it doesn't tend to be live, and you can listen to it whenever you like. It doesn't have to be a particular time. Okay, so why podcasting? So you can use podcasting to share your research and to give a platform for early career researchers like yourselves to present and discuss their research. So it increases the impact and reach of your research. And this way you can also engage the public in your research as well. So using science communication skills to explain your research to perhaps a lay audience. This is really a great skill to learn from podcasting. It's a really good way to network with your peers, academics, and other stakeholders in your field through podcasting. You can invite them to your podcast for interviews, and you can work with your peers on a podcast. And it's also really fun to do. So yeah, how can we get started with podcasting then? So we're going to talk about different stages of podcasting. The first stage is developing your idea. So this will cover the topic, your team, how to name your podcast, and the audience as well. So looks like there's some chat as well. Just have a look. Developing a research project, would like to include a podcast series, which is the theme of the project for general audience. Running the podcast, looking to hear about your expertise. Okay, great. So some people who have a bit more experience with podcasting, and some people who are in the process of developing a podcast as well. So I guess the first thing to think about with a podcast is the topic. So there are some questions to guide your thinking about. So what will the podcast be for? What do you want to gain out of it? What topics are you interested or passionate about? What topics do you have expertise on? Are there any topics that cover this podcast? Are there any podcasts that cover this topic? It's not a problem if there are other podcasts, because right now there's so many podcasts out there, but can you bring a new perspective or new expertise to the topic if there is already a similar podcast? And in terms of your topic, you might also consider narrowing it down. So a more focused podcast will hold more value to a smaller group of listeners than trying to target everyone. So for instance, if I were to plan an addiction research focused podcast, maybe I might consider covering a specific population of people who experience substance use disorders, or specific interventions for treating addiction, for example. So providing a bit of focus basically to the topic and not keeping it too broad. So once you have an idea of topic, you can think about reaching out to people with similar interests. So it might be other PhD students in your research group, or people in your department who have similar interests, or even PhD students from other universities through conferences or events or networks nationally. So basically finding a team of people that you can work with, because I do think that podcasting works really well as a team. It's a time-consuming and demanding project, so it would be quite difficult to do on your own, and quite hard to motivate yourself to do it on your own, I think. So in my experience, we were interested in experience of PhD students and also in addiction research, as this was our background. So obviously there are a few podcasts about PhD experiences, but for us, we felt that we could bring a new perspective to this by covering some new topics and directing people to specific resources to be able to develop certain skills. For instance, getting extra funding during your PhD, additional opportunities to get involved with, how to make the best out of academic conferences and things like that. And we also added an interview with an expert to each episode to go beyond our own experiences. So this is kind of how we came about with our topic. Cool. Okay, so you have a topic. How are you going to name your podcast? So you can either use a witty title for your podcast or a descriptive name. So a creative name is something like a play on words, a pun, a niche term in your particular topic. But the problem with some of the creative names is that they offer no hints to the topic's to the show's actual content. So you need to be mindful of this, because new listeners may not click on your podcast or search for those terms if you have a really funny and creative term, but it doesn't really tell people what the podcast is about. So some examples of creative names are PhD Life Raft. So it's saying that this podcast will be a life raft during your PhD, or the vitamin PhD, a supplement to doctoral study. So a play on the words vitamin D. So the podcast will be a supplement to your PhD. But the good thing about both of these is that they include a reference to PhD in the title as well, so people can come across them when they search for PhD. So an alternative is a descriptive name. So this can be a bit less imaginative, but it's a bit better for searching. And what it involves is you call the podcast what your target audience would search for. So for instance, PhD career stories. I know what I'm getting when I see this podcast name. It's talking about career stories of people doing PhDs, or how to PhD. So, this is also very clear what it's about. Yeah, so this is what we would call a descriptive name. And if you want to use a creative name, that's fine to use, but you can try to combine it with a tagline that's a bit more descriptive, or include a keyword within the creative name. So similar to these examples here, so that even if it's a more creative name, people searching for your podcast can find it. So some further considerations about naming your podcast. So don't use overly long names, because this can create problems in some podcast platforms. But in any case, if you use a really long name, it can become quite tedious because you have to refer to it in each episode. So that's not a good idea. Try not to use a name that's already been used in a different podcast, or like a really similar name. Even though this podcast may not be active, this can cause confusion when people search for your podcast. So this is something else to think about. You can use the word podcast in the name of your podcast, but it can be a little redundant. So if your name is too long, get rid of the podcast. Sometimes people shorten it to the cast for the same effect. So like, for example, newscast. So you could sort of say PhD cast or something like that if you want to. A good idea is to test your podcast name. So tell the name that you've come up with to someone and ask them what they think the podcast is about. So this can give you an idea, is my audience going to understand what this is about, and is this going to appeal to them? And if you're new to podcasting and you don't have an audience at the moment, then it's better to go for a descriptive name, because this increases your chance of being found when people search for it. And remember, you can always change the podcast name later on. You don't have to stick to it. Cool. So you've named your podcast, but now I need to think about who your audience is. So this is one of the most important stages of developing a podcast. So if your content is not for a specific audience, it's not targeted, then it's not going to be engaging or inspiring. So when we think about an audience, there are a few methods to sort of sketch out who your target audience might be. And one of them is thinking about a podcast avatar or a persona. So this is the perfect, is the sharing stopped? My screen has changed. Are you still seeing the screen?
It's not sharing for me anymore.
Okay, interesting. Let's try that again. I did feel like something had gone wrong. Okay. How about now?
We're back.
Okay, so we're on the audience slide as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, yeah, we were talking about the audience. So I was introducing the podcast avatar or the persona method. So this is basically thinking about the perfect idealized listener for your podcast. So it might be helpful to sketch out who exactly it is that you'd like to listen to your podcast. And then you can keep this persona in mind when you're planning episodes. So thinking about, would our listener persona like this, or would they be interested in this? So this can help with planning your content as well. So there's a few more resources on developing or sketching out your podcast avatar that you can look at. But once you have an audience, once you know who your audience is, then you need to give them a reason to listen to your podcast. So they need to get something out of listening to your podcast. This is basically referred to as value proposition. So some of these terms are like technical. You don't have to worry too much about the terms, but you need to think about what you can offer to your ideal listener, basically. So one way you can do that is thinking about a problem that your audience will relate to. So for example, for a PhD focused podcast, it might be, difficulties throughout the PhD, maintaining work-life balance, working with supervisors. So some of the problems that your audience will be struggling with, and then think about how can you help them solve that problem with this podcast. So it might be about talking about your own experiences, giving resources, providing practical advice. But importantly, why should they come to you for that solution? So what isn't unique about you and your podcast? So this is an important aspect to think about. And finally, are there any action points from the information you give them that they can take away? So for instance, in our funding episode, we direct our listeners to specific source of funding so they can examine and apply to PhD funding through those. So some things to think about when you're thinking about your audience and what you're gonna provide specifically to them. Okay, so another quick discussion. So I think some people have already said that they have a podcast idea, but do you have a podcast idea? Do you know what you would name your podcast? And can you think of anyone you can collaborate with and what your target audience would be? So you don't have to necessarily know the exact answer to these questions, but just getting a bit of brainstorming going and an opportunity to ask any questions so far. So I think some people have already said, so one person has said they're running the Shifting Lens podcast for about 6 months. Okay. So research project on podcast series on care. Yeah, podcast this month. So Claire has mentioned that they're going to be in their first podcast. So what will that be about? For example, or if anyone has any of the ideas about what podcast they'd like to produce. Aimed at non-academics and early career researchers in human-animal relationships. That's really interesting. That's cool. Teaching and research. I'd love to do a philosophy podcast called I Think, Therefore I Ramble. Yeah, that sounds quite funny. And what would you name? I mean, yeah, you did say what you would name your podcast, but that is a good, funny name. But I do wonder if you can find it when you search for a philosophy podcast. So that's something to keep in mind. So yeah, it looks like, people who are already doing podcasts have some people that they're working with, and this tends to be people that are in the same department as you or in a similar area. So this is a good way to go about it. So what about a target audience? So what is your target audience for your philosophy podcast, Ben?
Philosophers? I don't know.
Is it going to be like, for example, general public who doesn't know much about philosophy, but is interested in learning? Or is it going to be someone who has, I don't know, graduate level philosophy background, for example? Yeah, like something to think about. Yeah.
Probably the former. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think a podcast if you're doing a podcast on that topic, you probably want to know how much your audience already knows about that topic and target it to their understanding. Yeah, I do listen to some philosophy podcasts, and sometimes it kind of goes over my head and I'm just like, oh, this is not for me. So yeah, cool.
It can be quite esoteric if you don't get the tone right.
Yeah, exactly. Or sort of assume people's knowledge in certain areas. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll keep the chat going and then we'll continue with the rest. So yeah, if you want to add anything to that, feel free to use the chat. Okay, so obviously we've covered developing your idea for a podcast. So the next stage would be planning your podcast episode. So we're going to cover the schedule, episode format and content, how long the episode should be, how much preparation you need to do, and also intro and outro for an episode. So in terms of episode schedule, you should select a schedule that you can regularly stick to, whether this is once every 2 weeks, once every month. yeah, it doesn't matter, but it just needs to be regular. And recording a few episodes before you start releasing your podcast is a good idea, because then you build some time to plan for future episodes as well. As I said, keep the schedule consistent and make sure your audience knows this, so you can include it in your podcast description, at the end of a podcast, or when you're sharing your podcast on social media. So when deciding how frequently you want to release your episodes, there are a few things that you can think about. So how long does it take to produce an episode from start to finish, and how many people can contribute to this work? And also think about the complexity of the content and production. So if you're doing an episode about which involves a monologue or a conversation between two people on a single topic without too many transitions, then it's going to be quicker to produce and edit. But if it involves more than one section, for instance, an interview and a conversation, this will require more time to prepare, conduct, and edit as well. So these are important things to consider when thinking about the schedule. And also think about your current workload, because how many hours can you dedicate to this a month or a week? And this might change, obviously, depending on the stage of your PhD. At the beginning, you might have more time, whereas in the writing up stage, where I am, your time is a bit more limited. So some considerations when you're deciding the schedule, basically. In terms of when you release your podcast, you might think about releasing your episodes on the same day of the week or the month, so the podcast can become a bit of a habit for your listeners. So it doesn't seem like there's a particular day of the week that performs better, but select a day or dates and be consistent with it. And again, share with your audience so they know when that is. And when you're thinking about the schedule, don't be tempted to prioritize quantity of episodes over quality. More podcast episodes doesn't necessarily mean more downloads if the quality isn't matching up or if the editing isn't up to scratch. So don't be tempted to produce more episodes at the expense of the quality of the podcast. You might also consider planning your episodes around important events or relevant times of the year. So when we were doing an episode about first 6 months of a PhD, we released this just before start of the term in September, so that people who are just starting a PhD can listen. So if your episode is around a particular conference on important events, then you might consider releasing an episode just before or after the events to report and summarize on it, for instance. So another way you can plan your episodes is using seasons in your podcast. So you can plan seasons of podcasts around a common theme. So for example, if you're doing a podcast about PhD experiences, you could have a season about late stage PhD. Or if you're doing a podcast about qualitative research methods, let's say, you could have a season about thematic analysis. And each episode would be focusing on a different aspect of these seasons. So for the late stage PhD, it could be an episode about writing up your thesis, arranging your viva, selecting examiners, etc. And if you're doing another example from a research-based podcast, for example, if I have a podcast about addiction treatments, I could have, for instance, a season about psychedelic treatments for addiction and dedicate each episode to a different psychedelic drug, for instance. So why would you use seasons? So this can be a good way to organize your podcast, and it's easier for listeners to navigate as well. So if I'm a PhD student who's in the late stages, I don't want to hear about episodes about funding your PhD, for example, or getting involved with additional opportunities. So I will be able to quickly find the information that I need or that I'm interested in. And for you, it can be good because it provides a natural break. So releasing podcasts continuously can be quite tiring and not attainable after a while. So it gives you some time to rest and review between seasons. So you can review what went well, what didn't, and what you can improve in the future. You can use this time to engage with your audience, either through social media or using surveys if you want to. You can check the statistics of download to see what episodes are more popular. So just reviewing how the podcast performed. There are some downsides to this because it's less flexible in terms of content, and not every topic that you want to cover will necessarily fall under a specific a common theme, and it might become less creative as you need to stick to season theme rather than coming up with ideas based on recent events or experiences. So something to keep in mind when you're thinking about using seasons, for example, in your schedule. Okay, so what about the episode format and content? So there are a number of different ways you can format a podcast episode. So the monologue is obviously, it's in the name, you're talking to yourself. The benefit is that you don't have to rely on anyone else to record the podcast, but it can be quite difficult for someone who's just started with podcasting. Talking to yourself on a microphone is awkward and difficult. And I think as a format, this style of podcasts can be less engaging. I think conversations are more engaging for listeners. And it also doesn't allow you to connect with a peer or an academic or another expert in your field during your podcasting experience. So another option is co-hosting. So you can present alongside a colleague or a peer. And this is a good way to get started because it will resemble a natural conversation. And if you have a co-host that you know well and get along with, then this could produce really good results because people enjoy listening to people who bounce off of each other. So obviously you need to take into account the schedule of the other person, but I do find that this is manageable. Another format is interviews. So you can host a podcast and interview experts in your field. And this could be a good opportunity to meet someone important in your field that you look up to. And the interviews themselves can bring their own audiences and share within their own network. And having an expert interview can add a level of authority to your podcast. The challenge with this is that you will always need to find and approach people and schedule interviews and hope they show up and hope you don't have any technical difficulties as well. I think if you have a group of people, then this may not be a huge issue to find people that you can interview because people have slightly different networks. And it's a really good opportunity to connect with someone who's not within your own network. But another challenge is that especially interviewing experts are going to be a lot busier than you, so it might be difficult to find time, and also technology, so they may not be as familiar with podcasting, so you need to prepare them with clear instructions for the recording. A few other formats, you can have a roundtable, so you have one regular host, a number of guests on a specific topic. You can have a documentary type podcast, so you have a host that explains through a range of interviews and conversations to give an overall picture. And there are a few other ones as well that I haven't included here that you can have a look if you're interested. So we use a mixture of co-hosting, interviews, and a bit of roundtable discussion because we feel like when we initially discuss a topic among three of us, that's quite nice to get an idea of people's personal experiences. And then we follow it with an interview with an expert because it conveys both our personal experiences and brings an expert perspective into the topic that we don't have necessarily. Again, with the podcast, you need to think about what would be suitable for your desired podcast topic, and that also the podcast format can change along the way. So if you find that, the conversation or the roundtable isn't working for you, you can change it up. It's not something you're tied to. And again, you can find this out. Well, you can find out what works best when you're piloting. I'll talk a little bit more about piloting later on, but just something to keep in mind. So in terms of content, I've sort of prepared some recommended things to include for both an educational or experience-based podcast and a research-based podcast. So, for example, if one of the PhD Addicted to Research episodes focused on stress and well-being during the PhD. So in terms of evidence-based information, you could have something about the prevalence of mental health or prevalence of stress within a PhD population. So giving some facts to set the scene about the topic. And then you can talk about personal experiences, so discussion of how we have experienced stress and how we manage our well-being during the PhD. And then perhaps having an interview with someone, so someone who supports PhD well-being. So it can be a tutor, a mental health professional, for example, and then also including solution-based practical advice and resources. So what steps can someone take if they're struggling with stress and well-being during their PhD? So obviously this is based on an example from our podcast, but you can apply this logic to any topic. And in terms of a research-based podcast, so you could have an episode based on a piece of research or a piece of news. It can be useful to keep it narrow, as this can give some focus. So we did an episode on a paper reviewing treatment options for cannabis use disorders. So I'll talk you through the example from that. So introducing the topic for a lay audience. So what is cannabis use disorders? Why does it matter? It matters because 30% of people who use cannabis develop this disorder. So what does the research suggest? What are the available treatments based on this research for us? And then going beyond the piece of research. So what are the limitations of the existing research? Are there any gaps in the field that have been addressed by subsequent studies? What has happened since this piece of research? Does this research piece tackle the question at hand, or do you need to go beyond and do some reading? And I think in some cases you might need to read beyond just one paper to kind of reach an overall conclusion about the topic. You can also include an interview with an expert. So we interviewed the person, one of the first authors of the paper, or you could interview someone who is who's a clinician, for example, dealing with people presenting with cannabis use disorders in practice. Again, you can apply this to your own field, but an interview with an expert that can provide a different perspective. And also finally including real life implications of research. So what does this research mean in our case for people who suffer from cannabis use disorders? So try to think about what does the research mean for people experiencing a particular problem or in a particular field. So try to have some implications beyond the research. So general tips about content and format. So I think conversation between more than 3 people can get confusing. So try to keep it to 2 or 3. If you're doing a podcast about personal experiences, experience of PhD, etc., you can talk about challenging topics. So you can talk about, issues and problems in academia in a general way without naming specific people, or you can frame it as colleagues have mentioned that they've experienced X, Y, Z, if you want to anonymize people's experiences. So just because it's a podcast, it doesn't mean you can't talk about these things, but just making sure that you talk about it in a general way. And just generally being mindful of not making defamatory statements. And it's important to remember that the content is going to be available on the public domain. So just keep this in mind when you're recording the podcast. Don't say anything that you're not 100% comfortable sharing with everyone online. And one more tip is that even though you might be familiar with a particular topic, try to ask questions from the perspective of a naive listener. So in a conversation with 2 or 3 people, you could have one naive and one knowledgeable co-host to contribute to the discussion and balance the conversation, because then it kind of feels like you're asking the questions that the listener would ask and they feel a bit more a part of the conversation. Okay, so how long is your episode going to be? So there is no hard or fast rules about the episode length. So people do say ideally no longer than an hour, but as short as possible, but no shorter. So don't cut or extend your content to fit a certain length. So what you need to consider when you decide, is this length appropriate? Try to ask yourself, have you covered the content that you want to cover without any repetitions, waffling, or going off tangents? So the podcast should be dense with value and entertainment. So that's something to consider. And again, this depends a little bit on the content and format too. Some formats can be a bit more engaging and you can get away with longer episodes, and some might be a bit less engaging So, you know, 50 minutes of monologue is going to be quite tough to listen, whatever the topic is, in my opinion, anyway. So when you're thinking about the podcast length, don't expect that people will listen to it all at once. So, you know, if you have a 45 minutes episode and you worry that, you know, that's too long for people to listen on a commute or whatever, that's fine, because people can dip in and out of podcasts, so they don't have to listen to all at once. When you're recording a podcast, allow a bit of extra time than the length of the episode, but do try to stick the time as much as possible. So if you want to record a 30 minutes episode, don't allow an hour, because you will probably go over that time. So maybe, you know, a little bit of a margin of error, but not too much. Let's say you're interviewing someone and it's already over time, so you wanted to have a 15-minute interview and it's already 15 minutes in, but you haven't covered all you want to cover, then, you know, don't cut it short just because of the time if you haven't covered the content. So continue the interview and then edit down things that perhaps are not as important. Just to give an example, our episodes have ranged from about 25 to 50 minutes, depending on the content and format. So if you've had like interviews, they tend to be a little bit longer. Yeah, just as an example, really. Okay, so you've got all of that nailed down. So you're going to start preparing for your first episode. How do you prepare and how much time do you spend? Again, how much preparation you need depends on the format and the content of the episode. So if you're going to cover an episode based on personal experiences, you can have a looser structure and prepare a few key points that you want to get across. And you can also note some rough time points for each point where you want to be addressing them. And this helps with keeping the conversation on track. So it doesn't have to be perfectly scripted, but, you know, I want to spend 5 minutes talking about this one topic, and then the next 5 minutes we want to go on to talk about this other topic, for instance. And if you're interviewing someone, it's a good idea to prepare some questions and send them across to them, and get the interviewers to prepare some bullet point answers and send it back to you, because if they forgot to mention an important point, you can bring it up so you don't lose interesting content in this way. So as I said, don't have a word-to-word script, because it will come across as reading, and this is not engaging for a listener in a podcast. So most of the episodes should be conversational. You can have a script for intro and outro, but the main podcast you don't need a script for. So you can have different sections in the podcast that are more structured than others. So I mentioned the episode about mental health, for example. So you can have the factual information within that section more structured. So you have key facts that you need to present at key time points, and then the section about personal experiences can be more flexible. So I'll give some examples of how much time it took us to prepare for different types of episodes, to give you an idea. So when we're preparing an episode on personal experiences, we first get together as a team of people who have relevant experience, and then each person spends a bit of time brainstorming key points and resources that they want to share. And then we'll meet about 45 minutes, an hour, to come together and discuss these ideas and organize the topics in a logical order, and then after that we'll record the episode. So there's not a whole lot of preparation there. And we also think about people to interview when we meet. Once we record a conversation, we'll get in touch with someone to interview them, arrange a time to interview, prepare some questions, which will take about 15-20 minutes, and, you know, give some instructions for technological prep, and then record the interview and then bring it back together with the conversation. So for a research-based episode that I've been doing for another podcast, the preparation takes much longer. So a group of us for this have spent an hour or so reading a research article and taking notes. We then met to discuss initial impressions and decided the next steps in terms of going beyond the piece of research. So what more information do we need? And then we spent another hour or so reading about a particular topic from that paper, and then another meeting to discuss the overall message of the research, what can people take from it, And from that, a couple of hours of preparing notes and recording. So as you can see, for a research-based episode, there's a lot more stages involved in the preparation. So something to keep in mind. Okay, so you've done your main content, and the next thing you need to think about is the intro and the outro. So the intro is the initial introduction bit to your podcast. This is where you tell your listeners what the episode is going to cover. So in this section, it's a good idea to include your name, the name of the podcast, who is the podcast for, what is the current episode covering. So I might say something like, my name is Merve, this is the Welcome to the PhD Addicted to Research podcast. This podcast is for PhD students or people interested in doing a PhD. And this episode will focus on getting funding for your PhD, for example. You could also say something along the lines of tune in to listen to top tips for writing your PhD at the end, for example. So give them something to look forward to at the end to keep them engaged with the podcast. So that's also a good idea to do in the intro. And the outro is when you're finishing of your podcast. So you thank your listeners. You can point them to your show notes. So if you've mentioned any links in your podcast, you can put them in there or direct them to a website, for example. If possible, you can offer a teaser of the next episode. So when will it be? What will it focus on? It's fine if you don't know what it's going to focus on, but you can just say, we'll have a new episode in 2 weeks. So keep your eyes peeled for that, for example. And a call to action. So either subscribe to your podcast, leave a review, share with your friends, sign up to an email list, whatever you can think of. So try to include one call to action per outro in an episode. So yeah, this should kind of cover general preparation for planning your podcast episodes. So I'm going to take a little break to have a discussion again. So do you know which format would suit your podcast idea? So would you want to do a monologue, a co-hosting, interviews, roundtable discussion? Do you have any ideas about how frequently you want to release episodes? And how much preparation do you think it will need for your podcast content and formats? So again, as I said, there's no right or wrong answers with these. It's entirely dependent on the topic. So just some brainstorming and an opportunity to ask questions.
I've had a question sent in, Marva.
Oh yeah.
So the question is, have you ever used any sort of pre-agreement on podcast ownership? I guess a bit like a prenup, to prevent one member from claiming it as their own. I
haven't come across that. I mean, I guess, because with our podcast, it's mainly been for our development and, having an opportunity to share our experiences and research. So it hasn't necessarily been something that, that is for profit or anything like that. So we didn't necessarily consider that. And, because we're in a group of PhD students, it's quite a positive environment. No one really claims it as their own, and it's everyone's in the group. But I think if the circumstances are a bit different, then you might consider having an agreement, but that's not really something that I'm familiar with. But I'm sure there are some resources online. If you look at the podcast host website, they do cover some things around co-hosting and intellectual property, I think. So maybe have a look there.
Sure. Is there a link for that somewhere?
There's a link to the podcast host website, but I don't have a particular link to that specific content, but I think it'll be easy to find on their website.
Sure.
I'll include it in the end. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, so one more person said, our target audience is anyone interested in critically considering human-animal relationships. bring research information to the general public in an accessible format while engaging academics and non-academics in a perspective shift. I suppose we would fall under research-based format. Yeah, I guess like these are not necessarily like this or that. I just kind of meant in terms of the episode content. If you're going to cover a piece of research, these are the things that you might consider doing. And it sounds like, in your podcast, you're trying to communicate research to both lay audiences and perhaps academic audiences. So you're doing a bit of science communication. Yeah, that would be, you can call that a research-based content. Yeah. So someone said, having come across that on a previous project, we did opt to form an agreement for our team. Yeah, I mean, also, if you're working with people that you don't really know that well, you might consider it. But if you're working with people that you have already a good level of understanding with, that might not be an issue. But yeah, if you're not sure, and if you feel like people might take ownership of the podcast, you might consider doing that. But that's not a problem that I've had experience with. I'm sorry.
To bring the discussion back to the format question, I'm just thinking about my hypothetical philosophy podcast. I guess maybe co-hosting would be the most appropriate for a kind of philosophy one, or roundtable even, because discussion and dialogue is quite central to philosophy as a topic.
Yeah, I think I've definitely listened to some monologue philosophy podcasts, and they have been quite boring, to be honest. I think definitely having a discussion either with one person or two person would be quite interesting. And then maybe you could bring in an interview with an expert for some episodes. Yeah, that could work quite well. No, to be honest, I'm lucky because I've been working with really, really nice people, so I haven't even considered that as an potential issue. So it looks like someone has a question, and then someone else is manually raising their hand. So I don't mind whoever goes first. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, Dorothea, you go.
More like, I think, like a thought about podcasting, because the language is very important. It's somehow related with what you said, that philosophy podcast can be really boring for people who are not really into the subject. Do you have, I can think of course, but from your experience, any idea what extent you can, well, not lower down the conversation, but really make it more accessible? Because anyway, the trends with, especially I can say about philosophy papers, is to use less complicated terminology and to make it more accessible to readers. So I imagine a podcast about philosophy would have the same aim, because you don't want people to just click stop.
Skip. Yeah, exactly. I guess it's about, not assuming knowledge and, defining your key terms. There might be things that are really obvious to you, but it may not be obvious to your listeners, especially if you're targeting a lay or perhaps an audience that's not particularly informed about that specific aspect. So yeah, I think providing definitions and not assuming people's knowledge would be a good idea in that case.
Okay. Thanks.
That's all right.
Tiamat, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting. And I think you gave such a really good, practical overview. So it wasn't just like a bunch of tips you threw at everyone, but it was really like a hands-on kind of starter pack. So thanks.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's really nice to hear. We're not finished, by the way. There's still more.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering maybe you can touch on this at the rest of it, so I'll keep my question short. But you're talking this morning about, I'm not sure if you were here, but the different forms of impact. And I guess sort of like, as Ben was saying with philosophy, but with podcasts as well, it's sort of that impact of how people view things or giving them new ideas and things like that. But I was curious if you had any sort of ideas or experience on your end about really practical applied impact, maybe calls to action or something that would be sort of a very direct, either for the listeners or the podcast itself as a form of impact. So I don't know if I just wanted to throw that out there. Maybe other attendees can write in the chat too their thoughts, but yeah, maybe you or anyone.
So did you mean like in terms of call to actions to increase the impact of your podcast?
Yeah, like if you're, I don't know, if you're having like a podcast on, in your case with PhD research, like well-being or something, of the podcast itself can be a form of impact that the listeners are affected by it, not just in how they perceive things, but maybe like their practices, or if you're speaking with two people who are maybe having conflicting views, that can also impact further knowledge in some way. Yeah, I just thought that was something I've been thinking about lately, sort of the different types of impact also within podcasting. So I just thought maybe.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, podcasts can contribute to research impact in a way, because if you're doing a research-based podcast, for example, it's an opportunity to share your research to a different audience potentially who may not have heard about your papers, or like you haven't published your papers yet. So it's an opportunity to share and discuss that in a different environment. In our podcast, we're all, obviously because we're all PhD students, it's when someone comes and talks about their research, it's quite a supportive environment, so they can sort of discuss it with people who are interested in their research, and also be able to share with people who may not necessarily be in academic environments and come across papers or attend conferences. So I think in that way, it's a really good way of making impact and sort of demonstrating impact in a different format as well. So you've got like written formats in paper or conferences or whatever, so demonstrating in a different way in terms of audio formats, and in terms of the impact of an episode, I guess you can share different calls to action, like you said. When we're talking about a paper, we share that paper within our links, or when we're talking about I guess perhaps it's not that relevant to impact, yeah. But if we've written other pieces of, for example, blogs or articles about the same topic, we include that in our podcast and share. So that gets a bit more traffic to those content as well. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think this is kind of the things that we do within the podcast. Yeah.
So just one last question from Anna, and then we'll get back to the presentation.
Okay.
I was wondering, if when you realize that you have audiences in other countries, so have you incorporated those audiences to the new podcast, or it's just something that you just stick to the initial audience that you were thinking initially?
That's a good question. I guess some of the content, it would be difficult for us to talk about PhD experiences in different countries because we don't have experience of that. So I think, yeah, we can try to be a bit more perhaps interesting to a broader audience, but our experience is within a UK PhD setting, so there's only so much we can talk to beyond that. But I guess with our research-based episodes, we can try to think about a broader audience, I suppose. I'm not entirely sure. I think in terms of research, we don't necessarily just cover papers from the UK, so that can be a bit broader. But maybe we can also think about, if we're talking about a paper that's been published in the US, we can think about for example, if it's a treatment-focused paper, we can think about the healthcare system there and try to contextualize it within that. But I think it would be quite hard for us to try to appeal to, all sorts of different experiences in different countries within a PhD, because, it can really change. But yeah, that's a good point. I'll try to bring that up with the team and see how we can make it a bit more interesting to a wider audience as well. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No. I just wondering, because it sounds really interesting, and sometimes like in other countries you might find different experiences. So, but I perfectly understand. It's difficult to try to reach all countries, different experiences, and so yeah. So I was wondering just to create these bridges between countries, and like, because even though there's some differences, there's also some similarities. So yeah,
yeah, definitely. I mean, it might be because of those similarities that people listen to those experiences, or it might be that like people listening from those countries, they're interested in coming to the UK to do a PhD, so they wanted to hear about the experiences. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm gonna make a note about that to discuss. I think I had one more thought about that when you said. I can't quite remember at the moment. But yeah, thank you so much. That's really an interesting point. Okay, so for the next stages, so we've got, someone else raised their hand.
Hi, Dorothea. You're muted.
Yeah, hi. I thought it's a bit of a practical question, but how do you deal if you include some sort of music on the background or like additional sounds? How do you deal with the copyrights?
Yeah, so I can answer that question now, but I also have a section on that later on. Yeah, that's a really good point. But yeah, basically in our case, we were lucky that we were able to find someone who would produce music for us for free for credits, and obviously that's not something that happens all the time. We were just lucky that someone in the team had a connection. But there are ways of getting copyright-free music for your podcast and not getting in trouble with that. So I'll cover that a little bit when we get to the later stages in the next section. Thank you. Okay. Cool. So I'm going to cover a little bit about recording a podcast. So just talking about recording equipment, some general recording guidelines, software, and briefly talking about piloting. So in terms of equipment, if you're just beginning with podcasting, you really don't need fancy equipment. Your phone is enough. I can tell you, we have been recording most of our episodes on our phone. I think some people in the team have some dictaphones, but nothing else. And it's fine. As long as the audio quality is not distracting, people will listen to a podcast if the content is good, regardless of whether it's been recorded on a high quality microphone or just a phone. I have some tips on improving the audio quality, which I will get to in a moment. If you do have some funding, you can consider some equipment. So these are a few pieces of equipment that have been recommended to me. I don't have a personal experience of using them because we don't use them for our podcast. But if you're interested, you might check these out. And you might be able to get something, I think the entry level one is about 20, 30 pounds or something like that. So, you can get something cheap, but for just starting out, you really don't need it. So don't worry about it. Okay, so in terms of recording software, obviously I said we record on our phones, but it's a good idea to have a backup. So you can use Zoom as a backup recording. And obviously it's very simple to use, and there's an option to get separate audio tracks. So basically you can get a separate track for each speaker, and this makes it a bit easier for editing because you have a bit more control over the audio. You also tend to get a decent audio quality, but if you have problems with internet, the audio might be distorted. With Zoom, you get also auto transcription, so it transcribes the sound automatically to text, and you can release this alongside your episode to improve accessibility. It's not a perfect transcription, so you will still need to spend some time going through it, but a useful feature at least. If it's not available through your institution, then obviously there's a cost attached to that, but I think most people here are attached to at the extra university, so that should be fine. And there's a few more resources that you can look into in terms of using Zoom for recording a podcast episode, including how to get separate audio tracks for each speaker. Another one you can use is Audacity. So Audacity is a free to use open source software, and you can also use it for editing. And obviously, because you're doing a local recording, the audio quality wouldn't be depending on the internet connection. So all of these things, I'm assuming that you're going to be mostly remote recording because, the pandemic, but also difficulties, in getting people together if you're based at different places. So that's kind of my lens into this. So the recording guidelines that I mentioned. So there are a few things you can do to improve the audio quality in your podcast. So as I said, if you're recording remotely, record each speaker's audio separately as a local file, because it will give you, allow you to edit each individual's audio separately. So, if you want to silence one person for a section, you don't have to silence the other person. This will make a lot of sense when you're editing the audio. But yeah, multi-track recording is preferable. And you can do this manually by having each person record their side of the conversation whilst wearing some headphones. And then you put the audio files together for editing. So record in a room with soft furnishing and plenty of furniture to minimize echo. So if you've just moved house, don't record it in an empty room. And also be aware of background noise. So is there a constant background noise in the room that will be difficult for editing? So you might have like an aircon, roadworks outside your building. I think someone in our podcast had a fish tank motor that was constantly on. So try to avoid this because it makes it more difficult for editing if there is a background noise. And you should use in-ear or closed-back headphones when recording to minimize noise bleed. So noise bleed is when your microphone picks up the sound from your headphones, so the sound of other speakers. So it will create an echo of your presenter's voice. And again, this will make it more difficult to edit because you will need to silence your own audio when you're not speaking to get rid of the noise bleed. So again, try to minimize it if you can. And also another way to minimize noise bleed is to keep your volume on your headphones as low as you can, as much as as long as you can still hear the person, but don't have it on maximum, basically. So that's another way to minimize that. So when you're recording, avoid having paper notes, or if you have paper notes, keep them to one side so you're not flicking through them. Turn off like emails or anything that's going to give you notifications, and avoid using the mouse because it will make a clicking sound. Before you record, test your audio to make sure it's not too loud or too quiet. If it's too loud, your audio will be distorted. When you're recording, keep the recording device close to your face, but don't move it during the recording. And make sure you hit the recording button, just make sure it's working, and make sure that your device has sufficient battery and storage to record your episode. You don't want it to run out mid-episode, or you don't want it to lose what you've recorded. So just some general tips to improve the audio quality and some guidelines around recording. So I'll keep an eye on the chat in a moment, but with piloting, so I mentioned throughout the different stages that piloting can be helpful. So it's a good idea before you start to record episodes to release, record a few pilot episodes just for the purpose of piloting. And you can use this to identify and address problems, what worked, what didn't work. And you can review things like the length of the episode, the content, the format, how much preparation you need, in terms of the schedule as well. So in our case, when we piloted, we identified some audio issues with the noise bleed. So we created some guidelines around that. And we also found that we needed a bit more preparation as a team before the podcast. So, just a few problems you can identify with piloting. And a lot of things will become obvious when you've piloted your episodes. And one more thing with piloting is that it can give you a bit more practice with editing, which I will get to next.
Written question about headsets.
I mean, I don't have a personal experience with this, but I know someone in our team had a headset, and we found that in terms of editing, because the microphone is so close to your mouth, it can be a little bit distorted. So yeah, in terms of editing, it kind of made it a bit more difficult. And I don't think you necessarily need the microphone to be that close to your face. When you have your phone, it just sort of like, I don't know, just next to your computer or something, that's kind of enough distance. So I don't think you need a headset with a built-in microphone coming out of it. Mic and speaker. Pros and cons beyond background noise. Avoid headphones to increase depth of sound. Yeah, as I said, so we do use headphones because we record separate files for each speaker. And yeah, I don't think there's any problems with background noise in terms of using headphones. It's more about, if you have constant background noise, try to avoid that. And the reason for that is, if you're editing something out and that person has a background noise, when you edit it out, it'll become obvious that you've cut it. So that's why we're concerned about background noise. As long as it's not too distracting, then it's not a problem to keep it in. It's more for editing things out that it can be a problem. Yeah, we haven't had an issue with depth of sound. Like, I'm not a pro in editing, so I'm just kind of talking about, like, so we don't do it to an extent that we're sort of pro editors, or like really really careful about editing and sound. Like, we're not sound technicians, so I can't really speak to that. But I think we haven't had a problem with headphones. And what we try to do is, when we have 3 speakers, you can sort of pan people, one person into the middle and the other two to the next, one to the right and one to the left, and that way it kind of sounds like they're in a room, like sitting on a table with the host in the middle and the other 2 on the side. So it kind of gives you a bit of that depth of space. Yeah, sorry, I'm not really that knowledgeable about super specific technical aspects in terms of editing and sound, but I think it just kind of goes to show you don't necessarily need to be, as long as you have a basic understanding, it's fine. Like, it doesn't have to be produced to a perfect extent to be for people to listen to it. We're not professional podcasters. This is probably something that you're going to do alongside your PhD, so you're probably not going to have time to think about overproducing and like thinking about small aspects like that. Yeah, I think the general message is that you don't need too much equipment. You can use your phone, a simple pair of headphones. You can get some mics for your phone if you want to have a slightly better audio quality. But at the end of the day, as long as the audio quality is decent, as long as it's not distorted, and the content is good, people will listen to it. You don't have to have like super high tech equipment, basically. That's in my experience anyway. And I guess the thing is that, like, you can bring those things later on when you've started and when you've done a few episodes and got it going. But perhaps at the start, it's not things that you need to necessarily worry about, if that helps. Okay. So just briefly about editing software. So I already mentioned Audacity, and it's an easy to use free software that you can use for editing and production. And you can edit and prepare a podcast episode with a few functions like cutting and silencing, inserting music, fading out, increasing volume, etc. And I would say the skills for Audacity are quite straightforward. Obviously, I don't have enough time to cover that within here, but I've attached a few resources that you can follow. So there is the basic Audacity skills from the research and development page. So this kind of shows you how to use some of the functions of Audacity. And there's also a YouTube video about basic Audacity skills for beginners. and the Audacity have a very detailed manual themselves as well that you can check out. So I'll tell you a little bit more about general editing tips and guidelines here, basically. So here I've included a link to something called minimum effective editing method. So this is something that you can use to get started with editing. So in this link, they talk about 2 different stages to this. I think the second level is a bit more appropriate. So that's what I'll talk about. So what does this minimum effective editing method include? So this involves recording your main content, intro and outro, and then you import it to Audacity, remove the silence at the beginning, and line up your individual audio files. You find and chop out big mistakes, where you've had to repeat the sentence or something like that. You amplify the volume to a standard level, and then you would import your theme music and your audio, a transition audio, which is referred to as stings, and then you would use the shift function to put the music in correct places. So for instance, the intro, outro, and transitions with a slight overlap with the people speaking, and then you export and publish. So this is basically a really simple way to get started with editing and not worrying about very specific and small details. And here in this link, they also talk about, they also give you a guide on what to do if you make a big mistake during a recording and how to easily identify these and edit these out during the editing stage. So obviously you can just listen throughout the whole podcast and cut it out, but he gives you a tip to visually identify that in the audio, so you can just cut that section out in the editing without having to listen to the whole thing if you're doing a minimum editing method. So I think this is a good way to do it, because editing can take hours. Like if you get really stuck on tiny things, and I've definitely done that in the past, and it really isn't necessary. Again, when you're starting, you can use something like minimum effective editing method, and if you want to produce episodes that are like highly produced, then when you have more time or when you get more comfortable with editing, then you can try to edit it out a bit more. But in any case, you don't want to over edit it to the extent that it sounds mechanical. So this is an example of a video where different news anchors have been edited to say something that they're not actually saying. So they've cut words from different people to make it sound like they're saying something else. And it works, but it's very obvious that it's been edited in that way. So you don't want it to sound too mechanical, basically, when you're editing. And, when you're editing, it's easier to take chunks of sentences rather than a few words. So don't worry about if you've kind of said something silly at the end of a sentence. Like, either it's easier to cut the whole sentence out rather than trying to chop off a few words that someone has said. And most importantly, don't edit out ums and ahs, because first of all, this can take really long time, and I'm guilty of doing this in the past. But it's not something to do with editing. It should be something to do with practice. So leave those in. It's not that big of a problem, and you'll improve with practice, and you'll just not say those as much. And again, as I said, be mindful of background noises. So the reason I've said that is because when you're editing, let's say one person has noise bleed. So when they're not speaking, their microphone has picked up the other speaker's voice. So this needs to be silenced. But when you're silencing them, if they have a background noise with them, that background noise will also disappear. So it's going to be more obvious that you've done that. So that's why you need to be aware of those background noises. And if you silence someone who has a background noise, then you need to basically find a section of the audio with the background noise and paste it there, for example. This is quite specific, but I just wanted to give you an example why and how that can be important. Yeah, so I think these are my general tips about editing. It can take a really long time if you wanted to, and yeah, I don't think it's necessary. I've done it in the past, but I think I'm going to try to apply this minimum effective editing method more in the future, because it doesn't necessarily have to be overproduced, I don't think. Cool. Okay, music. So now we're at your question. So you don't have to have music in a podcast, but it can make it sound a bit more professional and well put together. And something to think about when you're thinking about a podcast music is that it should be emotionally neutral, so that it can be followed by both cheerful and difficult conversations, especially if you're talking about personal experiences. Not everything is going to be positive, so keep that in mind when you're choosing a podcast, because you don't want it to be something super high energy and happy when you've just had a really difficult conversation with someone. And also try to keep it short and catchy. In terms of when you're choosing, again, you can listen to some other podcasts that you like and see what their music is like. And the way we use the music is in the intro, outro, and for transitions. So these are referred to stings, or sometimes you can sort of use music to mask a bit of editing. That's obvious. So when you're looking for music, you need to look for royalty-free licenses, so that you don't have to pay each time you're using the music. So there's a couple of ways to go about this. So in this link, you can find copyright-free music. It doesn't mean this music is free itself, but if you get like if you pay a small fee for those websites, then you can access the music copyright free. So just a small cost in there. And there is also a free music library from the podcast host. So if you use any music from them, then you need to give them credit in your intro and outro and in your podcast description, I think. So it's something to keep in mind, but this could be a good way of finding music, because it looks like they have quite a big library. So you can look at those links to find music for your podcast that you don't have to pay for each time, basically, even though there may be a small cost associated with it. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah, as I said, in our case, we were quite lucky in the sense that one of our team knew someone who had done a music production master's. And he was happy to produce our music for our podcast for free, as long as we gave them credit, because they were, just starting out with their career. So that was something that they wanted. Obviously, I understand that's not something that's going to apply to everyone. So here are some resources that you can use to find something that doesn't cost a lot.
I automatically start thinking who among my friends can produce a music. Because I think it's always better to be customized in a way if you want to make it really catchy, because...
Yeah, true. I mean, if you know someone like that, obviously that's really lucky. That's amazing. But yeah, there are some options if you don't have that connection as well, or, if it comes with a cost and that's not something that you have funding for, you can consider these options as well. Yeah. Cool. So, okay, you've recorded your podcast, you've done your editing, you've added your music. Now you're on to publishing. So one thing to think about when you're publishing is a cover art or logo. So again, you can use some stock images to create some cover arts on a website, for example, Canva or Picture Chart. So I haven't used Canva myself, but a lot of people use it for making really cool infographics. So, it's a cool website to check out. And then I've used Picture Chart to make some interesting graphs for research. So there's a few different, there's loads of things available on there that you can use to design a podcast logo. And I've also included a link to look into in terms of, what to consider when you're designing a logo for a podcast. So that's a good one to check out. So when you do actually come to publishing the podcast, you don't actually upload it directly to, for example, Apple Podcast or Spotify, but you'll need to upload it to a media host or a podcasting host. So this is basically a service that hosts your audio files. So you create an account with them, you enter your details, and the show is ready. and then you'll upload your audio files, so your episodes, to this hosting account, and they will be stored and organized by the podcast host. So they'll create a feed that people can subscribe to, and they'll be delivered to your listeners on demand by the podcast host. So what happens is when you publish your first episode, you can submit your podcast to podcast directories. So these are things like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iTunes. So these are the directories rather than the hosts. And you only need to do this once. So you only need to submit to one directory one time, and then it will appear in their directory. And so once they know your podcast exists, they'll check in for new episodes, and they'll send them to your subscribers on their platform. And again, with the directories, you don't have to submit to every podcast directory, but if you submit to like top 4 or 5, then the other ones will pick it up as well. So I've included a link for podcast media hosts that you can consider. So the one we use is Acast, and I think there's a free option, but I've been told that we use a paid version because it automatically uploads the podcast to other directories. And once you publish the episode, you tend to get a URL that you can share with on social media or on a website. So actually it gives you an embedded code that you can embed the episode and play it on your website with as well. So if you have a podcast website, you can also include it in there. And once it's uploaded, the people who've subscribed also get an alert, obviously. Yeah, so this is what happens with publishing. And there's also a list of top podcast directories that you can check out. I think definitely Apple and iTunes is a really big one, which was surprising to me because I'm not an iPhone user. So it seems like, if you want your podcast to go reach a decent number of people, you definitely have to submit to Apple and iTunes, and it seems like our largest listeners come from that directory, so that's something to keep in mind. But there's a couple of other ones that you can consider in that link. Okay, so before I go into the next bit, I'm going to check through the chat because I'm aware that I haven't been able to do that. Okay, Canva is really easy to use, typically free with uni email address. Yeah, and I think also Pictochart is free to an extent with a university email address as well. So that's the one I've used for making some graphs for papers. Okay, so a bit of my advice from personal experiences, unless there are any other questions at this point. Okay. Doesn't seem to be. So you don't have to be in the same place to record a podcast. I think before the pandemic, this was something that a lot of people would have taken for granted, but we've been doing all of our podcast recordings remotely. I haven't met some of the people in the podcast team in person before because of the pandemic. So, don't be limited by location. You could do a podcast with literally someone anywhere in the world. And this also means that you get to interview and connect to people wider across the country or across the world. So don't be limited by location. And in a way, I think it works better with recording because when you're recording in the same room, obviously you can't have separate audio files for different speakers. So it gives you a bit more flexibility for editing when you're recording remotely. As I said, you don't need fancy equipment or lots of funding to get started. I think there are a lot of things that can be added on to your podcast later on. But I think when you're starting, try to keep things basic and sort of getting things done, but don't worry about getting things done perfectly, basically. That's what I mean there. And in terms of the podcast, things can change with time. You might change the format, the content, or the frequency of episodes. So we've gone from every 2 weeks to once a month because of our workload. And also in terms of the content, we're including more episodes on research-based episodes as well. So yeah, you don't have to be tied to a specific format or content or frequency. It can evolve. Going back to something about the impact. So when we do episodes, if we have other relevant content, like blogs or papers, then we mention these in podcast episodes, because then, you know, you're giving people something else to look at. So, you know, oh, I've talked about this topic in a blog as well that you might want to read. Here's the link. So, you know, you're connecting to another resource, and I think that's a really good thing to do, both in terms of, like, you know, getting more traffic to, you know, the blog or the paper, but also giving people some more resources on the same topic. So I mentioned this a little bit, but always have a backup recording. You know, you can do this either on Zoom or Teams, wherever you're meeting. It's always better to have a backup recording with lower quality audio rather than having to re-record, because obviously the conversation gets a bit more rehearsed. You don't want to do the same thing as you've just done. Yeah, so always have a backup, basically. Okay, so a few more tips. So I've mentioned, you know, it's a good idea to have a team of people. As PhD students or early career researchers, we have various responsibilities and we have periods with more work. So if you're in a team of people, then, you know, you can help share this workload and make the process more enjoyable working with people. I've got to know these PhD students across the country through this podcast. So, you know, it's been a really great experience in that sense. So, you know, try to get the most out of the podcast experience in that way. So one thing to add is you can disagree with each other on a podcast. You don't always have to agree when you're talking about a topic. And I think it can be quite interesting to present opposing views. So don't worry about not having the same opinion as others, especially when you're talking about, you know, experiences or even research. Because if you're always agreeing with each other, then you're just presenting one perspective. So you know, don't worry about having disagreements, basically. So use social media and your networks to share your podcast. So it might be your research groups, fellow PGRs, the doctoral college, if it's relevant. And you can also create a social media account for your podcast, and a hashtag to engage with your audience. So, you know, you can try to have a dialogue with them and ask them what they'd like to hear about, what topics they're interested in, you know, ask them to suggest people to be interviewed. So you can create a bit of a dialogue with the audience. And if it's too much time commitment for you, offer to go on other people's podcasts. You know, if you're interested in podcasting, it doesn't mean you have to completely start from scratch and make your own podcast. And there's a website here where you can search for relevant podcasts. So, you know, just get in touch with the host. The worst they can say is no, but I think people are usually quite happy to find people to have on their podcast. So that's definitely something to consider if you're interested, but you don't quite have the time. Okay. And just a few resources. So I mentioned the podcast host website. This is a really, really great website covering every single stage of starting a podcast. And they also have a podcast which has bite-sized episodes on specific aspects of podcasting. So you can listen to that. So it's a podcast about podcasting, which is quite meta. And also another podcast called Podcasting Simplified from the website Podcasting Insight. Again, this is worth having a listen. And this website also has a free email guide to podcasting that you can download. And finally, another podcast about podcasting, but this is from media and cultural studies perspective, if anyone's coming from that area. So talking about, I think, the culture of podcasting. So some of the episodes might be interesting. And some Exeter-based resources. So there is a citizen journalism course, which is a 3 weeks online course on podcasting, and all Exeter students can access this. And there's loads of resources covering every stage of podcasting. So, you know, from choosing a podcast, tips for conducting interviews. So you can select different resources that are relevant to you, or go through the whole course. There's lots on there. And finally, the researcher development Ellie page for PGR. So there's some workshop and materials on podcasting, including a panel discussion and the one about Audacity skills that I already mentioned. Okay, and finishing off with a little plug. So I mentioned this like multiple times. Listen to our podcast, PhD Addicted to Research. And then we also have some blogs about PhD experiences that are kind of overlapping with the podcast episodes. So you can also read these on this link if you'd like. And some thanks to these people for helping all of us produce the podcast. Cool. And questions, obviously.
Thank you so much, Marva. That was great. Really nice.
And I just want to say, it can be a bit overwhelming, all of this information. So, like, don't worry about learning everything at once. You know, use this as something that you can come back to if you want, and go through each different stages. Yeah.
What I'll do is I'll share the slides around with everybody who's signed up via Eventbrite, so you can access all the links that Marva put on the slides, and then you can follow along when you have the recording, or just scroll through yourself. Yeah, amazing. I've learned a heck of a lot, Marva. Thank you. And I'm now full of creative enthusiasm. I want to go and.
That's exciting.
I hope I'm sure everybody else feels like that as well. But yeah.
Oh, I hope so. I mean, as I said, like, I may not be an expert on every aspect of podcasting, but just giving a little bit of an overview and, directing to resources when I don't know something. So hopefully that was a good introduction.
And infectious enthusiasm as well. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, great. I'm going to. We were fortunate enough to be able to have quite a lively discussion during the talk, so I might limit questions now, because it'd be quite nice to have a comfort break before we switch formats from audio to video and talk to Tom Nicholas, who's up next. Oh, Anna, you have a question? I'm happy to talk about questions, but people feel free to go and have a comfort break if they like.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Merve, I was wondering if you use any kind of software or platform in order to know, like, the amount of downloads, or like some statistics about like podcasting, if you know any of those resources.
So I think the information I shared here is we got it from our podcast host from Acast, I believe. So it gives you a few different things, like downloads by location, and then also it has like downloads by different podcast directories. So we saw that we had the most downloads by Apple and iTunes podcast, and also downloads according to date. So we can see that the episodes release dates are the ones where you have a bit of a spike, and then it goes down a little bit. So I think, so that's something that's available on Acast. And I think other podcast hosts should be able to provide similar statistics as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
All right, great.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Marva. Really, really great talk, really informative. So I'm going to bring things to a close now, so everybody can have a bit of a relax, but round of applause for Marva. Really, really great stuff.